Hello and welcome to Real Opinions. This is part of a special Halloween feature that will provide a brief overview of the horror genre in gaming, with different recommendations for every type of player. Today we're going to be talking about Resident Evil. So those who don't know, and I've already done a video on this already, Resident Evil 4 is my favorite game of all time. I consider it to be the best. From its incredible level design to memorable boss battles and immensely satisfying combat, it's a game that does just about everything right. But that's not the game I'm going to be talking about today, nor will I be recommending it at any point in this series of videos. Why? Because as great as it is, it's not a horror game. It has scary elements, and it's unbearably intense at times, but realistically, it feels much more like an action-adventure game than a proper horror title. In fact, you'll probably notice that some die-hard Resident Evil fans resent it, as it's often cited as the moment where the franchise began to lose touch with its roots. But of course, you can't do a protracted horror feature without at least making a passing reference to what is the most famous horror series of all. After all, Resident Evil popularized horror gaming. It's basically the reason I fell in love with games in the first place. Sure, there are horror games that kind of predate the franchise. There's Alone in the Dark, Clock Tower, Sweet Home. I know about these games. You don't need to comment and tell me about them. I get it. I know they exist. But this is the first one that was really any good, and it established 90% of the conventions that came to define the genre in the following decade. Every trope of horror games, from limited ammo and health supplies to the weird emphasis on riddles and exploration and even fixed camera angles, all of that, it started with this game. This is the real genesis of what we call survival horror. For those who don't know what survival horror is, it's the best kind of horror game, really. It's a subgenre of horror that towers above all others, including action horror, stealth horror, stalker horror, first-person horror. You know, all of these other games we've been talking about have been different, but none of them, apart from Resident Evil, have been survival horror. Alan Wake was action horror to an extent. Evil Within was action horror as well. Until Dawn's sort of point-and-click horror. I don't know, that was a genre into itself. Outlast is stealth scare horror, as is Alien Isolation, but this is pure classic survival horror. And it's the best genre. The reason for that is because it has the best pedigree. It has the best catalogue of games, because it's the genre that Silent Hill and Resident Evil belong to. So by extension, it's the best one, because they're the best games. If you ask people to pick the best franchises in gaming, you can almost guarantee that at least one of those two will come up. So it goes without saying that when these games were at the height of their powers, around like the 1990s and the early 2000s, it was a wonderful time for horror. When you talk about the golden age of horror games, you're basically talking about a time when these two franchises were reigning supreme, and by extension, it was a time where horror games meant survival horror. So what is survival horror exactly? Well, I'll break it down for you, and I'll use the first Resident Evil as a kind of clear-cut case study. First and foremost, the subgenre is primarily concerned with its kind of this specific type of tactical combat that prioritizes efficiency and carefulness, as well as supply conservation above all else. These games are brutal with their health and ammo, and Resident Evil is certainly no exception in this regard. The go-to strategy is therefore to avoid combat as much as possible, but you have to notice that combat is still a core element of a survival horror game. This isn't like Outlast. This isn't like Amnesia. You will have to fight at some point. But they're not outright action games either. They're not Resident Evil 4, they're not Evil Within. They're somewhere in between. It's a delicate balancing act that Resident Evil executes flawlessly, giving you the mentality of a hardened survivor rather than a useless wimpy victim or an overpowered super soldier. Being considerate with supplies is thus the key gameplay mechanic, as well as general inventory management. In Resident Evil, you have to really kind of pay attention to what you're holding and how much stuff you've got. It even goes as far as to make mandatory items like keys and puzzle objects take up space, which means that you can only ever take a limited amount of firepower with you. If this sounds restrictive or harsh, that's because it is, and it also makes things unbearably risky. Every time you enter a new area, you won't know if you're properly equipped for it. In fact, for all you know, there could be a boss battle just around the corner, and you're just carrying a Keys. There is one area in which Resident Evil does admittedly go a little overboard, and that's with dictating the amount of saves that you can have. You're forced to use a limited amount of ink ribbons in order to record your progress on a typewriter. And I'm all for punishing difficulty, but sometimes I just need to save because I've got shit to do. I don't want to feel like I'm at a disadvantage because I used one of my ribbons when I needed to pop down to the shops, but you're limited in the amount that you can save. That feels a little overboard to me, and also the ink ribbons carry up inventory space. Another convention of survival horror is the distinctive use of setting. You then backtrack around these labyrinthine areas looking for keys to doors that then lead to keys for doors that then lead to keys for other doors, and so on. It means that you're constantly traveling back and forth across a single area, unlocking more of it piece by piece. In Resident Evil, the setting is the infamous Spencer Mansion. And whoever the architect of this place was, he had one hell of a job to do, by the way. His areas are blocked off with all kinds of reasons. Like, you need to locate objects to slot into holes and find keys to open doors to solve these really obtuse puzzles in order to unveil secret passages, and I have no idea how the original owners got around. If they wanted to visit the fucking garden, they need to find 4 separate keys, 2 different emblems, a sheet of classical music, 4 ornate masks, a specific lever, and some jewels. And then I guess they'd have to put them all back in their original places when they were done. Oh, and at one point, the bloody roof would start closing on them. They must have put all the stuff back, because we find it in the right place. Again, this might sound like a lot of hassle, but it's perhaps the game's greatest strength. You get to learn every brick of this mansion by the time you're done, and you will become familiar with all the shortcuts and all the dead ends. As a result, every locked door will gnaw incessantly at your brain, and you won't be able to let it go. You'll have to get through there. You'll need to know what's on the other side, and when you finally get to it, the reward will feel thoroughly earned. It just appeals to a completionist sensibility in us, as you check off every room in the mansion one by one, but it's not like, bloody Assassin's Creed where you just have a map filled with crap to do. The backtracking also helps the pacing of the experience immensely, as you gradually peel back layer after layer of the environment, uncovering new mysteries and new threats as well. I'd take a well-designed single location like this any day of the week over a bland and repetitive empty open world like Just Cause or Far Cry. The Spencer Mansion is a creepy-ass residence with a boatload of charm and hidden secrets. This is one thing that I miss about old-school horror games that we don't really have anymore. Survival horror also revolves quite heavily around complex puzzle solving, something which is certainly front and center here. And these are no simple filler puzzles either. And stuff requires you to think outside of the box. In fact, forget the box. Some of these conundrums would leave the fucking Riddler scratching his head. Half the time you'll be trying to come up for a solution for hours, only to realize you don't even have the required tools yet. Once again, I'm sure this probably sounds off-putting, but you soon get into the swing of things, and you'll appreciate the way that the puzzles break up the scares. After all, what's the point of them being there if they're not going to challenge you? Oh, and as for the scares, survival horror games usually employ a very specific type of horror. It's less about being hunted by ghosts or sneaking around maniacs in the dark, and more about fighting off a variety of creatures. In Resident Evil's case, the monsters are all the result of genetic experiments occurring in a lab beneath the mansion. They come in very, very diverse forms, from zombies, before they were in fucking everything, to giant spiders and mutant reptiles. They all behave in different ways, they all have different abilities, and it helps keep combat fresh and interesting. You'll never see too many of the same type of creature either, and the bosses are pretty great, especially if you pick up the 2002 remake of the game, which I thoroughly recommend, because that has this creepy recurring boss called Lisa Trevor, who's unkillable, really scary character, really, really scary, with a good backstory too. The remake also introduces a neat little twist on the standard zombie enemies in the form of these imaginative creatures called Crimson Heads. These are basically super zombies, with a name deriving from the red pigmentation of their skin. They're fast, they're strong, and they're very hard to kill. The gimmick with them is that they only appear after you've killed a traditional zombie. So if you return to an area in which you previously put one down, then there's a chance that it may get up again, and now it's upgraded. So, you have this thing where you kind of don't want to kill the zombies because you might turn them into super zombies. The only insurance you have to prevent this is to either burn zombie corpses with a lighter, which of course has a limited supply of oil, or to try and pull off a headshot, which is tricky because this isn't a game in which aiming is something you feel like you have much control of because of the fixed camera angles. This changes the entire game, as you're never sure if you should risk killing a zombie just in case you have to return to an area later. It creates a wonderfully scary dynamic where you're constantly worrying about oil, your bullets, and the monsters heading towards you. It's a genuine predicament. Do you leave the zombie be? Do you kill it and use up some of your lighter fluid, or do you gamble and just hope that he won't turn into something worse later? You'll try your best to ensure that you never have to deal with Crimson Heads, but I promise you'll fail, and that's a good thing, because the constant fear that they might show up makes for one of the most exhilarating experiences in any video game. Survival horror is by far the most heavily directed style of horror game as well. What I mean by this is that all of the scares are premeditated and designed under very precise conditions. To many modern gamers, this might sound like a bad thing, but it really isn't. It's the exact opposite of Alien Isolation, where everything is kind of random. And apart from with Alien Isolation, which I think does it well, I think that this random nature of a lot of games with unscripted scares is never going to be as effective as something intentionally, deliberately thought out by a true master of the craft. Honestly, I don't mind getting a very linear game. I don't mind linearity. I think it's underrated, because having something that's crafted with the most unbelievable attention to detail and care is good. Resident Evil is an exemplary instance of this, with almost every moment being an iconic fright that never fails to deliver. There's so many legendary scenes in this game. The initial zombie attack, the bit where the dog jumps through the window. It's so good to have a game this meticulously designed, and it means that you get the optimum experience. I know this is what I said about Resident Evil 4, and it's what I'll say about this one too. It's for the same reason that the fixed camera angles work so well, because they don't hinder your enjoyment. Each change in perspective is entirely deliberate and has a specific purpose, be it to guide you to a specific item or to set you up for a scare in a way that, like, they want you looking here, so that then something surprises you there. It plays with your perspective in interesting ways too, keeping enemies obscured and out of sight. Or there's like a bit where it tricks you into thinking that something's behind you when it's actually a reflection in the mirror, because it's using these camera angles in really kind of clever ways. In short, Resident Evil is a textbook example of a great survival horror game. It has deep gameplay, intricate design, and a suitably intense combat system. Most importantly of all, however, it is more than capable of delivering a good scare. And this is the penultimate entry of the series. I just realized that. You can't really get much better than this masterpiece. Having said that, I have left the best for last, so do check that out. Should be going up tomorrow. So, recommendation for those who want to immerse themselves in classic survival horror and see where it all began, Resident Evil is the perfect starting point. Also, a decent pick for fans of B-movies, creature features, and zombie films. And I'd give this one an 8 out of 10 for the original and a 9 out of 10 for the remake. So do check out for tomorrow, like and subscribe, because tomorrow will be becoming my ultimate #1 pick for best horror game of all time. Thank you for listening.